Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you.
Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so we're starting the laws of matzot. Here we go. It says in the Torah, so these are the things that you can use to make matzah, right? The types of grains that you can fulfill your obligation for the mitzvah of matzah. So what grains do we have here? We have chitin and seurim, right? First we have wheat and barley, kusmin, which is spelt, which is oats, the chiffon, and we have rye, right? So we have the 5 grains, basically. Those 5 grains are the ones that you can make matzot with and do the mitzvah of matzah. Aval lo be'orez, right? V'shamine minim. But he says not with rice, though, right? You can't do it with rice or other types of, grains or legumes. Vegam enan ba'im lidei chimutz. So he says also, when it comes to rice, it doesn't really leaven, right? It doesn't have the property of leavening. So therefore, he says, mutar la'asot b'hem tavshil. So you're allowed to make a cooked dish on Pesach, with rice, because, right, it doesn't leaven. The Chol Minei Kitniot also it says all kinds of legumes as well, just like rice, same thing. Okay. V'yesh osrim lechol orez. So he says, right, there are those authorities, that forbid to eat rice on Pesach, like the Ashkenazim, right? They don't eat rice on Pesach. V'chol minei kitniot betavshil, also other types of legumes in a cooked dish. Lefi sheminei chitin mitarvin behem. So what's the reason why they forbade this? Because what happens is that sometimes the wheat is mixed together with the rice. In other words, they use the same sacks, for the wheat and the rice. In the old days, that's the way it was. Nowadays, nobody does that anymore. But in the old days, they had traces of wheat in the sacks. And because of that, it got mixed up with the rice. And therefore, right, they forbade to eat rice on Passover. This is the reason why. So says the two, right? Chumay tirahi, right? The Zolon says it's a extreme stringency. He says, right? The tour. Velona hagu. So he says the custom is not like that. So in the time of the tour, you can see, right, that he holds that it's it's a stringency which is overly done, like too much, right? Extremely stringent. So he says, right, the custom is not like that. So you can see, right, in his days, which is about 600 years ago, the custom yet did not come in, into the Ashkenazim to avoid eating rice. At that point, they were still eating rice in Ashkenaz, because the truth is, right, that the Tur was living in Ashkenaz. He was living in Germany. That's where he was. So you see, right, that the custom came in a little bit after that, after the Tur, because during the time of the Tur, right, it was still considered to be, something strange, to avoid eating rice. Just interesting point, interesting observation. Okay, so that's the story there. Let's see the Bet Yosef. So it says Bet Yosef, where's the source for all this? Mishnah beperek kol sha'ar, right? It's over there in the Mishnah. למד היא עמוד א', ובגמרא, הנה אין אורז ודוחן לא מנה הנה מילי. So he says, right, that you're allowed to use the 5 grains, from matzah, as we said, right, the 5 grains. But when it comes to, rice and millet, those are not kosher, right, for making matzot. You cannot make matzot with that. What do I mean to say? You can make matzot if you want, but that's not the issue, right? The issue is that you can't fulfill your obligation with that. The mitzvah of eating matzah cannot be fulfilled by, bread which is made from rice or millet. Right? Lo mena hanamile. Lo mena hanamile. So the question Gemara asks is, right, how do you know that, right? How do you know you can't use rice and millet? Amar Reish Lakish, so this rabbi says, V'chen tana dever Rabbi Ishmael, Amar Kara, because the verse says, Lo tochal alav chametz, shivat yamim. You don't eat, right, leaven for 7 days, tochal alav matzot. So you can eat 7 days matzot. That's what you do. Dvarim habayim lidei chimutz, adam yotze behem midei chovato. So what do we learn from this verse? Things which can leaven, you can use them, right, to fulfill your obligation for matzah. The problem is, right, that rice and millet do not leaven, and therefore you can't use those, right? That's how it learns it out. Matzah. Yatsu elu shenem bain lidei chimutz, ela lidei sirachon. So he says, right, that even though, you may think, right, that when you cook rice, it does rise a bit, right? So you may think that's leaven. So comes the Gemara and tells you that even though it does rise, but that's not called leaven. It's called, right? How do you say this, right? It's like degradation. It's like what do you call it? Right? It's getting spoiled. So it's a spoiling process. It's not a leavening process. Even though it looks like it's being leavened somewhat, but it's actually being spoiled, right? It's being so therefore, right, since rice and millet do not come to leavening, therefore you can't use it to make matzot. That's what he's telling you.
Are you sourdough?
I'm sorry. Sourdough is made out of wheat, no?
Well, I know, but when you're saying it's spoiling, is it like that? Like it's
No. That's a little bit different. A little bit different. You're talking about the fact that it's getting sour. But what we're saying is like this, that when the rice rises, it's just spoiling. It's not leavening. It's a different kind of a process,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's just I guess you could say it, right? It's a different process. Even though I haven't really researched it, in terms of the chemistry of it, but that's pretty much what the Talmud is telling you, right? That it's a different process. Even though it looks the same on the outside, but it's not. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says. So Rashi explains right over here, right? So he says, as again, right? It just spoils, it doesn't leaven. Rashi says, right? So it says furthermore in the Gemara, Matnitin delok Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, right? So he says, our Mishnah is like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Diamar orez min daganhu. Why? Because this Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds that rice is a type of grain, basically. So in other words, the chayavin al chimutzo karet, and he says therefore, right, it does leaven according to him, right? So there's a minority opinion here in the Talmud which says that rice does leaven. So in this perk he says in Pesachim, Kuf Yudalad, Tanan Heviu Lifnei Matzav Lifanav Matza Bechazrav Bechazeret Becharoset ושני תבשילין וגמרא, מה ישנה תבשילין? אמר רבונה, סירקה וארוזה. So let's go a little bit slow, right? Let's slow down. So he says, right, that it says in the Gemara there, in the Mishnah there's a Mishnah, that they brought in front of him, right, in front of this rabbi, whatever it was, they brought matzah, they brought chazeret, right? What's chazeret? Chazeret is like romaine lettuce. charoset, right? It's charoset. You know what's charoset, right? That stuff, they make out of the fruits, right? The muddy stuff. Ushnet tavshilin, right? And two cooked dishes they brought. So in the Gemara, right, it asks over there, "My shnet tavshilin." What two cooked dishes are we talking about? Amravuna silka ve'aroza, right? So it says, right, they used to bring two things. One is silka, right, which is spinach, and aroza, right, is orez, which means rice. So one of the cooked dishes that they brought there was rice. So what do you see by that? You see, right, that it's kosher for Passover, right? Which means it doesn't leaven. So you learn from this Gemara, where it says, right, Rav Asher, that we don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And what does that mean? That we don't hold that rice leavens, In other words, it's not an accepted opinion. Damar Orez min daganu. So he says, right, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds, as we said, right, that rice is a type of grain, and it leavens, you're liable for that. So according to that, also, according to that opinion, you can also fulfill your obligation for Passover by eating right, the matzot, which are made out of rice. Rashi explains there, right? So explains Rashi, right, that you see from there, as we just explained, right, that since they used to use one of the cooked dishes was rice, and they had it on Passover, that means that they were not any concerned whatsoever that it leavens, So therefore, right, we see from there that we don't paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So the Gemara paskins that rice does not leaven, right? Basically, that's the idea. Okay, good. Let's go on. So he says, Bet Yosef. So as we said, right, now brings the tour, right, this custom of the Ashkenazim, which is that they don't eat rice on Passover. So says the tour, right, so he says it's a big stringency, you know what I mean? In other words, it's too much, right? Overly stringent, he says, the tour, right? So as I told you guys, right, that it's very strange because, apparently it's strange because the tour was Ashkenazi rabbi. You know what I mean? And he was living in Germany. So how is it that he, didn't pick up on this custom of the Ashkenazim not to eat rice? So the answer is, as I told you, right, that in his generation, the custom apparently didn't take effect yet. The custom came in later on, after the tour. Okay, good. So he goes on. V'gam Rabbeinu Yerucham, right? It says also Rabbeinu Yerucham katav otam shenagu shelo le'echol orez min hakitniot, right? So he says those they have a custom not to eat, rice and legumes, mevushal bePesach, which is cooked on Passover. Minhag shtutu. So he says, right, it's ridiculous custom. He says, incredible, right? He says it's ridiculous.
Kavod Harav, who said it was ridiculous again?
Rabbeinu Yerucham, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So you see, right, that the tour and Rabbeinu Yerucham, they both hold that it's not a good custom, even though they were both Ashkenazi. That's a trick, right? Okay, so and by the way, they're not the only ones. Rashi also says that.
And yet so many Ashkenazim today will not only not eat rice, but they won't let it be in their house. They get rid of it with
Right. That's going a little bit too far, right? That's even further than the Ashkenazi poskim, right? That's already going, it comes from ignorance, basically.
Crazy.
So yeah, it comes from ignorance. But anyway, right, as we said, Rashi also held that way, and also Rabbi Meir Mirotenburg, right, who was the rabbi of the Rosh. So they were all Ashkenazi rabbis, these rabbis, and they all held it was nonsense. Basically, okay, well, what can I tell you, right? It is what it is. But today, nowadays, though, it's different, right? Nowadays, the Ashkenazim don't eat it, and that's the way it is, they have a custom, so they can't change that, until Mashiach comes, right? When Mashiach comes, they'll all start to eat rice, like everybody else. Okay, it is what it is, right? What can you do? So yeah. Zulati imhim osim lechamir al atzmam velo yadati lama. So he says, I don't even know why they're being stringent about it. He says, right, Rabbi Nerucham. I don't know what the reason is that they're stringent. He says, okay, whatever. Right. So it goes on. V'agaot maimoniot. Right. This is one of the commentaries on the Rambam. He says, Katab Hashem Samak. He writes the name of the Samak. Ala kitniot kegon polin b'yadashim. He writes regarding the legumes, right? Like lentils and the peas. Yesh nuhagim isur le'acholam b'Pesach. Again, right? He says there are those who have a custom not to eat those on Passover. V'chena Rab Shmuel me'avira. Also, this rabbi, but he says these rabbis were eating it, right, on Passover. Rabbeinu Yechiel and also other rabbis. They're all Ashkenazim, these rabbis, by the way. They're not Sephardi. Okay. Anyway. So it's but it's very hard to, he says, be lenient since others are already customized by to be stringent. So he says, right, that the reason of the custom to forbid, right, the rice is not because it leavens, because the Talmud already decided, right, that it does not. So that's nothing to talk about anymore. The lo ta'u in shebeze betikuנות shel bet rabban yod'in oto b'shul minan b'gema de'en ba lidei chimutz, right? So it says in Gemara that it doesn't leaven. Ela chamisha minim bilvad. Only 5 grains, right, come to leavening, as we mentioned, right? Those 5 grains. Ela asur mishum de dagan maaseh kedera v'kitnit maaseh kedera. So he says the reason why they forbade it is because grains are made, right, in dishes, all kinds of dishes, and also legumes are made in dishes, so they can get mixed up one with the other, right? They can get confused. That's the whole thing. Gezerah ha'atuha. So he says one may come to the other, right? For instance, I'll give you an example, right? Like the Ashkenazim, when they make cholent on Shabbat, right? So some of them put rice in the cholent, whatever. Right, but the which is okay for Passover, right? But the thing is that what do you call it? But wheat, the Sephardim for cholent they use wheat. They don't use rice, really, so much. So therefore, right, you can come to confuse one with the other. This is the problem. So he says this is the reason why they forbade, to use rice, because you may come to confuse it with wheat. Okay. וגם יש מקומות שעושים פת מקטנית. So also there's another thing, which is that there are places in which they make bread also from legumes, like rice. They make rice bread. So they're going to come to switch it with porridge, right, which is made out of wheat. Which is made like in a pot. But he says when it comes to vegetables, though, right, which don't resemble grains at all, so they're not going to come to switch those, right? So therefore, the vegetables are still allowed, right? You can have carrots and whatever, right? Things like this. So he says also sometimes what happens is, as we already mentioned, right, is that sometimes what happens is that the wheat is going to be mixed up with the rice together in a sack. This is also another reason why they forbade, because in those days they used to use the same sacks for the wheat and for the rice, so they used to get, sometimes mixed up together in one sack. And this is another reason why they forbade that. So you can't really, pick it out very well. You can't, pick it out and, remove all the wheat. It's hard to do that, right? To sift it out, whatever. So therefore, they just left it alone, So he says also another thing, which is that, right, another reason why they don't eat on Passover, the rice. So he says the problem is like this, nowadays people, in the old days, they knew the difference between rice and wheat. They could see the difference, right? But nowadays, these people are not so, they're not so conscientious about these kinds of things. They're not so, right? They don't recognize it very well, so therefore he says they can get confused. Another reason why they don't eat it, right? So these are all the reasons why the Ashkenazim, forbade to eat these things, because they get confused one with the other, mixtures, all kinds of things. But when it comes to the issue of leavening, right? So everybody agrees that rice does not leaven, right? That's a different issue. We're not talking about that. Okay. The Piresh Rav Sadia Gaon, it's like the Rav Sadia Gaon explains, Ad Kana Shalom, the Gamma Mordechai Katav Pek Kol Shah. So he says this Rabbi also writes, calls it B'Shem Samak, in name of the Samak, he writes all these reasons. Velet Techash Ledvarim Halalu Zulati Hashkenazim. So says the Bet Yosef, right? The only ones who are really stringent about this is the Ashkenazim, right? There you go, right? So you see, right, that the Sfarim, they never took on this custom of not eating rice and legumes, right? At least at the time of Maran Bet Yosef, at that time, there was no Sfarim like that. Today, there is also, the Moroccans, right? They don't eat rice and legumes and things like this, certain things like that. But the truth is, that when they came to Eretz Israel, the Moroccans, the rabbi told them, Maran, he told them they should change their custom, and go back to the original custom, which is to eat legumes, So he told them to change. Some of them did, some of them did not. Some of them listened, some of them didn't listen, right? So whatever, right? Came out the way, turned out to be some kind of a compromise, whatever. Somewhere in the middle. Okay, good. So that's the story with the right, the grains and rice. So again, right, to sum it up, basically, we'll sum it up in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's go to Shulchan Aruch. We'll sum it up. So says the Shulchan Aruch, right? Elu devarim sheyotzim b'hem yidei chovat matzah. So these are the things you can make matzah, right? To fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. What are we talking about? V'chitim seorim, right? Wheat and barley, kosmin, which is spelt v'shibolet shual, right? Which is oats, v'shifon, right? Which is rice. So these are the 5 grains. You can make matzot and fulfill your obligation with that, right? There are some people who have gluten intolerance, right? In our times, it's pretty common, right? I hope you guys don't have that. But anyway, so the ones who do, the question is, right? How do they do the mitzvah of matzah? So I think, from what I heard, is that oats is okay. You can use oats. So they have oat matzah. The ones who have a gluten intolerance. Am I right? Am I correct when I say that?
I have heard this, but the gluten-free that you buy in the store is usually potato.
Oh no, potato. Potato is a different story, right? That's not matzah, right? That's a very different story.
Right, it's not. But that's when you buy it in the store. That's usually what the gluten-free is. It's potato. So I guess people would have
right, but you can't fulfill your obligation with potatoes. You know what I mean? So,
but I've never seen gluten-free that was was oat.
So yeah, so what I heard was, correct me if I'm mistaken, but that the ones who are gluten intolerant, they can have oat matzah. Which is which is the same thing as like Cheerios. Cheerios is made out of oats, right?
Right, but I don't think I've ever seen it. That would be a first.
Okay, I have seen it, by the way. I have come across it. Yeah, check it out. Look into it and let me know, right? If I'm mistaken or not. Whatever. Well, we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that issue. I'm sorry. What were you saying?
The shmur matzah or like the square ones?
Well, to fulfill your obligation, you need shmura matzah. You know what I mean? So you got to make it shmura.
I'll make a point to look for it.
Yeah, we'll look into that, Bezat Hashem. But that's what I heard. From my memory, I remember that's what they told me, that they're allowed to have that. They're allowed to have oat matzah. So they make a special batch for them, and that's how they do the mitzvah. Otherwise, they can't do the mitzvah at all. They have a problem, yeah. So anyway, right? Anyway, we'll get back to that. Bezat Hashem. We'll just stick to the basics for now. So I'm just pointing it out. Whatever. So anyway, right? It says, so he says in the parentheses, right, from the Maharil, he says the custom is to make it out of wheat dough. In other words, that's the best thing, if you want to do the best matzah, the wheat is the best, that's the custom. So you know why that is, right? Because it tastes the best. I mean, more or less. Like barley is not really very delicious. I mean, it's not exactly it doesn't exactly hit the spot, barley. Whatever. So, the best is the wheat, in terms of the taste and whatever. So he goes on the Shulchan Aruch, right? Aval lo be'orez, right? But you can't make matzot for the mitzvah, right? At least from rice, obviously, right? As we said, v'shar min hakitin, or other types of legumes, right? So you can't make corn matzah, right? Like they make those, today those, right? What do they call those? Those wraps, right? They make it out of corn, right? All kinds of stuff like that. You can't make, matzot from corn, right? Or it's a legume, or rice, right? As we said, or any other legume, for that matter, right? All the more so potatoes, by the way, which is totally like, totally out in left field somewhere, right? Obviously, it's even worse. So, so he says also another thing, which is that, right, as we said, rice doesn't leaven, right? It rots. So same thing happens with all the other legumes as well. They don't leaven. Mutar la'asot lehem tavshil. So therefore, you're allowed to make a cooked dish on Passover, with legumes, no problem, right? No issue with that. If you go to a Sephardi seder, right, they have a nice big plate of rice on the table, over there, right? A big nice tray of rice for everybody. That's the way it is. Okay. In Israel, it's so common, like everybody has rice on Passover, like except the Ashkenazim, like just it's very widespread. Okay. Anyway, so as we said, so says the Ramah here, V'yesh osim, right? So the Ramah brings the custom of the Ashkenazim, right? That they don't allow to eat legumes on Passover. V'aminhag be'Ashkenaz le'achamir. So he says the custom in Ashkenaz is to be machamir. So you see, right, that even though the Tur wasn't Ashkenaz also, but he was before the Ramah, about 100 years before, right? So it seems like that 100 years, is when the custom came in to forbid the legumes, right, in Ashkenaz. So he says also, another thing he says, that you're allowed to use oils, right, which are made from legumes. What does that mean? To light candles, right? Not to eat them. If you want to light candles, so you see from there, right, that you're allowed to have that in your house. Even the Ramah says, right, you can have it as your right, your candle, your candle lights, whatever, right, your candle oil, right, whatever. Another thing the Ramah says is that, right, if it fell into a cooked dish, right, some legumes, it gets nullified, right? So the even the Ashkenazim are lenient about that, right? So what does that mean? It says the Mishnah Brura gets nullified in the majority. So if there's a majority which is not legumes, right, and the minority is legumes, so even according to the Ashkenazi custom, you're allowed to have that, because it gets nullified in the majority. So if you have some Ashkenazi friends, right, who have all kinds of strange ideas in their head, show them this Ramah, right, and tell them that right, they're a little bit mistaken, they're going a little too far, with certain things, right? Because they think, as you said, right, some of them think that they can't have it in the house, and this is not correct, right? Obviously, it's not correct. Okay, so so the Ramah says this right here again, right? You would think, you're right. You would figure that the Ashkenazim, they know the Ramah, but they don't even know. Some of them don't even know the Ramah. So it says here, right? You're allowed to have it in the house. He says, right? Explicitly writes the Ramah that you're allowed to have it in the home, right? So you don't need to sell it to a guy, all kinds of stuff. This is nonsense, right? Stuff. Going way too far. Okay, so the zera kliza, right? The anis anilar, so these things, he says, these vegetables, right? these are like seeds, he brings all kinds of seeds over here. He says they're not called legumes, so therefore you're allowed to have them. So I don't know exactly what these seeds are, by the way. We could find out, maybe. But he says, right, that not every seed has the din of legumes, so therefore it's even allowed for Ashkenazim, to eat those things. There are certain seeds, right? But I know, like, for instance, when it comes to tchina, right, which is made from seeds, right, Ashkenazim don't eat tchina on Passover. They don't eat hummus either, but hummus is like more obvious because it's a legume, it's chickpeas. But they don't eat tchina either, the Ashkenazim, which is made out of seeds. But here, right, these seeds that he brings over here, the Ramah, he says that they're allowed to have these seeds. I don't know exactly what they are. There, we can find out. There. Okay, very good. So that's the story there. That's the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, let's see what else we can do here. Yeah, maybe we can pull off one more billionaire before we stop. We can do maybe bet billionaire. Let's see. So it says the tour like this, right? ואם עירב אורז עם אחד מן אלו המינים ועשה מהם עיסה, אם יש בה טעם דגן, יוצאים בה וחייבת וחלה. אף על פי שרובה אורז. So the tour says something interesting over here, right? Let's say you mix in together, right, one of those 5 grains that we mentioned, together with rice, and you made bread like that, It's like, one of those multi-grain, right? Multi-grain breads, right? So can you fulfill your obligation with that on Passover? So says the tour, yes, as long as it has the taste of, you can taste the wheat in it, the grain. You can taste it. So he says, even though the majority is rice, if you can taste the grain, says the tour, you can fulfill your obligation for matzah. Okay, so that's the tour. Let's see the Bet Yosef here. So says Bet Yosef, right? What's the source for this? Mishnah beperek Gimel Dichala, right? It's in the 3rd perek of Chala. Mishnah Zayin. Ve'uva beperek Kol Azbachim. It's brought down also in this perek Shnit Tavru, Ayin Chet Amud Bet, Amud Aleph. V'ketava Rambam perek Vav. Rambam also brings it down. V'ketava Rabba. It says the Ravad. So says the Rabbi, there's also another condition, he says. You have to have enough, right? You have to have at least a kazait of grain if you eat like, a whole meal's worth of that matzah. Right? And it says Rabbi Magid, but he says, according to Ramban, it seems like even if you don't have that much kazait, when you're eating a whole meal's worth, you can still fulfill your obligation with that. So it says, you know why? Because the main thing is the wheat there, even though the rice is the is the majority. And it says that's why they mentioned wheat and rice specifically. So it says that's the way it's brought down Yerushalmi. וגם רבנו בפרק ו' מהלכות ביקורים, also רבנו the tour, he says, כתב משנתנו בדין החלה בקמח חיטים בקמח אורז. He also wrote that regarding the issue of getting mixed up with wheat and rice. בקמח אורז ומשמע דווקא באלו, it says וכן עיקר, and that implies it's only with these 2 that we say this halacha, not with the other types. וכן נראה. So what does that mean? He's trying to tell you, right, that only with these 2 types we say that when it comes to rice and wheat, right? That even if we have a lot more rice than wheat, the wheat is more dominant there. It's right. So even though the rice is a majority, it's still you can still fulfill your obligation for the matzot by having matzah like this. Of course, today nobody does this. I mean, you know, it's not the most practical thing in the world. Nobody makes matzot, you know, with the rice. You know what I mean? Today. But anyway, right? It's good to know that there is such a possibility. Doesn't hurt. וכן נראה מדברי הראש, this also comes out from Rosh, he says, בהלכות חלה, in laws of חלה, ומבואר שם מדבריו, this is brought down also in his words there, אפילו באין כזית, אכילת פרס. Even if you don't have a kazite, right, which is 27 grams, which is the olive size, right, in the time that it takes to, in the amount that it takes to eat a meal, right, pras, im yesh ba tam dagan, as long as it has a taste of the grain, יוצא בה, you can still fulfill your obligation. ולכן סתם רבנו וכתב משנתנו בלי שום חילוק. So he says, therefore, right, Rabbeinu here, right, the Tur wrote this without any dispute, since the Rosh holds that way. והרשב"א בפסקי חלה שלו כתב כשכדברי הרעב"ד, הנה לא עיקר. But the Rashba holds like the Ravad, right? You have to have at least a kazite of wheat right there, together with with the rest of the rice. You know, so there seems to be a dispute about this. Okay, very good. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch and we're done. So says Shulchan Aruch very simply, right? If you make a dough, right, with wheat and rice, mix it up together, multigrain. You're doing your multigrain, right? Dagan, as long as it has the taste of the wheat, of the grain, you fulfill your obligation with that on Passover. You know, can you imagine? Yeah, what kind of you ask, you know, your host, right? What kind of matzot do you have there? Oh, gee, it's a multigrain, right? It's rice and wheat together. Like, oh, gee, like, you know, it's pretty surprising, right? But in theory, right, we can do such a thing like that. So you see, right, that he doesn't pass like the Ravad. The Ravad says you have to have at least one kazite, right, of wheat product there, right? In the whole meal's worth of your matzah there, which is three eggs. So therefore, right, the rule is you don't need that as long as you have the taste of the grain there, right? Which, by the way, it's not so easy to discern that taste. You know, for me anyway, I don't know. I probably will have a hard time with that, right? Discerning between the taste of the grain and the taste of the rice. You know, whatever. So anyway, I'm not going to do it. I promise you. I won't make any matzot with rice, at least this year anyway, right? I won't do it. Doing another. So anyway, right, so I hope you guys understand. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll finish here. Be blessed with wealth, health, and happiness. B'ezras Hashem. You should have a great Passover, which is the time. You know, I just made a post, by the way, the other day, yesterday, I think it was, that there's a midrash that says something incredible. You know, it says that just like, you know, the Jews were redeemed on the 15th, you know, on the night of Passover, the 15th of Nisan. So he says, right, the Mashiach will also redeem us at that night only. So it says in the midrash there that if you think that Mashiach is coming in a different time, right, not the night of the 15th, he says you're mistaken, right? You're making a mistake. You should know, right, that you got the wrong date, because the redemption of Mashiach will occur also the same night, right, which is the 15th of Nisan, just like the Exodus from Egypt. So right, you should know, right? So somebody tells you, right, Mashiach is coming, right on right in January. Tell them, I'm sorry, the Midrash says not like that, right? You have to wait till the spring, right? Till April, right? Which is the time for Passover. Okay, Chazak Baruch. We'll see you tomorrow, B'ezras Hashem. Chazak Baruch. Laila Tov.
Kavod Harav, thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you.